Welcome to Capitals Uncovered, the Pelle, Neroth, Taylor, and Martin Sieff show. And we've got John Helmer, friend and returning guest, who's with us very often, and an absolute pleasure to have you on, John. Martin's away at the moment, so it'll be just us two. And we're going to cover. We usually cover Russia, but we're going to cover that other big country in the Northern Hemisphere, or that is, I think, the second largest country in the world after Russia, which is Canada, of course. You've got an Australian background and US citizenship. And I've always thought about Canada as a sort of cross between the Anglosphere and Scandinavia because of its political views and its far north geographical orientations. I've always thought about Canada. However, I noticed I've been on about half a dozen Canadian podcasts, and I'm never invited on a second time. It's because I can't stop myself from giving what I see as the accurate view of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And then I guess they get hundreds of Canadian people writing into them saying, don't have this guy on again. You know, they're very strongly pro-Ukrainian. And I'll say we're going to talk about Canada now because I've seen there's a kind of Canadian-American trade war, which is also a culture war in a way, and is a way for a political conflict between the two big countries on the North American continent. I think the Americans are pulling their horns in the Middle East and maybe in Europe. I know there are two views about that. Some people say that Americans are just shifting over the expenses on NATO, but they still want to run NATO. And the other is that it's this east of Suez moment, like the Brits in 1971. They're pulling out of Europe a little bit, but they're going to lock down for sure the Western Hemisphere and make it their own. We had a guest from Argentina last week who said, yeah, the Americans are all over Argentina. They're going to try and get the... Okay, Marty, should we start again?
Any way you like, man. Okay. If you want to start again, I can do it on the big screen.
No, well, no. Let's carry on like this. All right. Okay.
That's fine. Any way you like, Pelle. Sure.
The Canadians are sort of in the American eyesight. The Americans tried with Greenland, and of course, there's a lot of people saying, well, the Americans are bullies. They can't do down Iran. They can't do deal with China, but they're going to bash the Canadians instead. And a lot of Ukrainian people, I mean, not just Ukrainian Canadians, but that kind of view has seeped in that we are the new Ukraine. We've got Putin, Hitler in Russia, and now we've got Putin, Hitler, Trump right next to us, and he's going to colonize us and destroy us and he thinks he owns us, just like the Russians think of Ukraine as a little brother, which they can dominate. And perhaps there is some truth in that. But there is another view, which has got a bit more nuance, which says that the Canadians are not actually I mean, what the Americans want is they're all part of NAFTA. They've been spending their money on defending the Canadians, so they've spent very little of one of the lowest GDP per defense in terms of defense, and they've been freely trading with China and using Chinese components in their manufacturing exports to the United States. And the Americans are paranoid about this. They say, well, the Chinese are not allowed to use Canada as their Trojan horse for business into exploiting NAFTA. And they seem to have struck a deal with Mexico. They're happy with the Mexicans for not doing this, but the Canadians are standing firm. And I guess there's kind of irritation with Carney posturing, saying we're much more European than the Americans, and his ice hockey parallels and his kind of appealing to the massive anti-Trump feeling that's in Europe, a massive anti-American feeling in Canada as well. So he's making a lot of political hay. I don't trust quite the mainstream UK coverage of the candidacy. They're nearly always siding with Canada, saying that Lutnick, the Secretary of State of Commerce, came in at the last moment and sabotaged it. So, I mean, because they get Russia so incredibly wrong, are they not likely to get this wrong as well? But I haven't got to the point where I've spent hours now studying it. So although I'm skeptical of the mainstream coverage that takes Canada's side, I can't present an alternative counter theory. We've got Martin with us now. And John, we were exchanging some thoughts about this before the show. You tend to think that, do you think Carney has a case with this breakdown? How does it look from your perspective?
Well, let me just go back a minute to declare a Canadian interest. Yes, I was born in Australia, but 59 years almost to the day, I fell in love with a Canadian girl in Montreal, and I spent a lot of very happy days in Quebec in 1967, which was the centenary of Canada's founding. And I've developed and had long relationships with Canadians. One of the most regrettable ones was when I worked with Chrystia Freeland. She was then an editor at the Toronto Globe and Mail, and I was the Russian business, or the Canadian business in Russia correspondent for the Toronto Globe and Mail. So I spent a lot of time dealing with that woman, who's one of the nastiest, most vicious, and least Canadian. Yes, she's a Ukrainian, and finally she has gone to where she belongs. She's now an advisor. She's out of Canadian politics. She is the advisor on Western money raising for Zelensky in Kiev, where she has an apartment, and she works now for the Rhodes Foundation in England. What Prime Minister Carney did to get rid of her wasn't quite to change, and he can't change, the Ukrainian lobby hatred for Russia. That's true. What Carney's got to do is to replace the dismal performance that Freeland and Trudeau turned in relation to China, and Canada must now develop an alternative approach to China, whatever the Americans think. But Carney is now mobilizing a level of hatred for America that I've not seen in any of the English-speaking former colonies, or of the English-speaking colonies of the present US empire. It's hatred for America. Let me explain, because it's Canadian politics and it's clever Carney Liberal Party politics. I'll explain that in a minute. It puts Trump far more vulnerably,
Yes,
in political terms, than the American coverage has been able to show. I'll come to that in a minute. It all rests on whether the Republican senator for the state of Maine wins or loses. Because if Susan Collins, loses, and Maine is very exposed to Canada now, the US Senate may tip for the Democrats. But just to go back, when Carney made the press announcement last Saturday that he was pulling out of the trade talks, he referred only to America. He could have talked about Trump, who's hated in Canada. He could have talked about Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary. He could have talked about Jameson Greer, the US Trade Representative. He could have talked about Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary. He could have talked about them all as potential enemies in this negotiation, but he didn't. He focused only on America. Now, why did he do that? The answer is that next Monday, August the 31st, it's by-election day, 3 significant Canadian by-elections, which will, of the 3, 2 are likely to go to the Liberal Party. And in the present polling, Carney's hostility to America is lifting his popularity, and he's driving the Conservative Party and the Tories, that is, into the shade. The key by-election that Carney wants to win is, believe it or not, in Quebec. It's in a place called Chicoutimi, or Fjord. And guess what it has in that electorate, or that riding as it's called in Canada? It has large aluminium sheet plants, large aluminum, give it its Canadian and American pronunciation, aluminum production for auto composition in the United States, aluminum sheets and alloys, as well as lumber mills. Hatred for the US, resistance by Carney to US tariffs plays very well in that Quebec riding. And right now, the polls show the Conservative Party, the Bloc Québécois, and the Liberal Party are running neck and neck. So what Carney is doing is converting this national feeling of national Canadian sovereignty against the Americans. He's converting that into political capital. Now, on the other side of the border, Trump is far more vulnerable than the American reporters understand. I already gave you part of the political map. And people who write about these trade issues don't usually understand about political party or election issues. All of the border states with Canada face particular problems if this tariff war stays worse. My own view is it will last only past November the 3rd. The key state that is exposed to this vulnerability, that will suffer, the key American state that will suffer if Canada suffers, as Trump intends and says, and as Lutnick in his standard vulgar form of speaking intends. The key state that will suffer is the state of Maine in northeastern United States. That's currently held narrowly by a Republican senator named Susan Collins. She faces a very serious Democratic challenger who on the current polls can beat her. This goes very badly for Collins in Maine. And if Maine is lost to the Republicans in an extremely narrow election result for the parties in November the 3rd in the US Senate, the Senate could tip to the Democrats. One state, Maine, could do it. Now, I'm not sure that North Dakota, Montana, they both have Republicans. Michigan and Minnesota, they're the other major border states, both Democrats. Not much chance of change there. But Maine is not little in the same way for Trump on November the 3rd as Fjord is for Carney next Monday. Now, when you understand this politics, in my opinion, you understand what Carney is saying is pitching at Liberal voters, independent voters, Tory voters in Canada. He is mobilizing a level of deep-seated nationalism in Canada, which is rare. What he has to do now is to prolong that for his election purposes and threaten Trump past November 3rd. If Maine goes to the Democrats, the Canadians can agree because Trump will agree. And if you have a look at what Trump had to say, yes, Trump has been extremely patronizing and nasty to the Canadians. It's grist for the Canadian mill. But when you look at the only tweet he's so far made, and I'll just read it out, it's pretty soft by Trump standards. He said August 23rd, so yesterday, Canada wants the benefits of being a state without being one, 3 exclamation points. They've also charged our great farmers for many years massive amounts of tariffs. No more, 3 exclamation marks. That's pretty soft by Trump's standards. The insult, pretty weak. The focus, he's in his own limited mental capacity. He's focused on tariffs affecting particular categories of voters. He speaks of farmers. The Canadian side is concerned with aluminium refinery workers and trucks. I've got to mention that one of the key producers of heavy trucks in Canada that are exported to the United States is also in the Fjord constituency. It's in Sainte-Thérèse, Quebec. Now, truck duties, heavy truck duties, is one of the issues on which the trade negotiations apparently failed. The other issue that Carney mentioned was French culture in Canada. That was a direct pitch at the Quebecois. And finally, you've got an attempt by Carney to mobilize constituencies away from the Conservatives and against the Americans. And that leaves him the winner. That's not bad politics. You could call it cynical, but it's far more damaging to the Americans than the Americans are ready to admit.
Okay, before handing over to Martin, I'm just going to suggest I just read everything through the prism of the Alex Kreiner view of the world, the Promethean action, which is the British versus the Americans, and the British who are at the heart of the whatever you think of Trump. Trump is a hostile. He's not part of the liberal Atlanticist consensus, and therefore he's not useful to the British. And so I wonder if the
Precisely.
Canadian intelligence, very close to MI6, are sitting. How can we get at Trump now that he's not supplying Patriot missiles to our beloved Ukrainians? We'll use our old friends, the senior Dominion, Canada. So they're sitting
Yes.
there with the Canadian intelligence, with MI6, with Carney in a huddled room in a secure facility where American intelligence, and they're saying, how can we screw Trump? This is it. He's a Bank of England man. His children are transgender. I mean, this shibboleth, this idiot idea of the globalist Atlanticist elite, he ticks all those boxes. Sorry, Martin, you want to say something?
Oh, indeed. First of all, as usual, John, I agree with you on all the essentials. But as usual, of course, also I will quibble on specifics. The key thing here, just expanding a key point that you established at the beginning, is political and election cycles. President Trump has been has been president of the United States now for coming on for 7 years. In two separate administrations, something not seen since Grover Cleveland. He's fighting his third presidential election. He won his first one. He won his second one by a striking margin. And his economic policies have been doing much better than they're given credit for. Domestically, they simply are. The raw figures are there. Analysts like Alan Donaldson have crunched the numbers, which do not come from Trump or Trump's people or Trump-controlled outfits. That is obsessed with the case. But by failing to rein in Ukraine, and most of all, by doing Israel's bidding on the catastrophic issue of Iran, and Iran, as Colonel Doug McGregor and others, and Professor John Mearsheimer and others rightly continually point out, has been strategically cautious, winning this conflict at every stage, and this is recognized in the United States. So President Trump, with a very hostile media against him in the US, is on the downswing. And every indication I see here is that the midterm elections here are going to be the kind of sweep you only see in American politics every 30 or 40 years, as I document in my book, Cycles of Change. 1930 was such a year, 1950 was such a year, 1974 was such a year. And these are years when there are democratic sweeps across Congress, and it's not just Maine. I don't think it's important, even if Susan loses Maine. There are pickups that the Republicans could have. They could still control the Senate, but whether they do or not, the House is what matters, where all the fiscal powers are. And I believe Trump is going to lose the House massively and would so anyway. But having said that, I think you're absolutely on the ball, John, with and you are too, Pelle, with the key point that Carney is a very shrewd, able politician. He's at the beginning of his election cycle. He's in the honeymoon period of his period in Canada. Historically, Canadian prime ministers dominate Canada and win 3 elections in a row and dominate Canada for 10 years. And then whether they're good or bad or successful or unsuccessful, the Canadian people soar on them. And it's not a bad system. It's worked, I think, rather well for Canada. But then out they go. He's at the beginning of his rise, of his 10-year period, just as Mrs. Thatcher and Tony Blair had in Britain. And President Trump is at the end of his. And he is, as you both say, a very shrewd, able, tactical politician. And he's also very crucially doing the bidding of the City of London at the same time. In the areas where the two of you had different analyses, again, I agree with both of you. I agree with both of you. But the key, where does this fit together? It's in Carney's interest for exactly the reasons you say, John. I fully agree with you. But Pelle is crucially right too and sets the context, as does our dear mutual friend Alex Kreiner. This is in the context of the City of London. It is in the context of NATO, on which Canada is a passionately loyal member, always has been, but is now an actively passionately loyal member, as opposed to the laid-back, relatively passive second-degree member, happy to play loyal best friend to both the United States and Canada, which has been the historic Canadian Canadian position through both world wars and certainly through the modern era through NATO. No, Canada has moved well beyond that now, and Carney has ambitions beyond that now, and he's being told by his handlers like Mr. Soros and the people in NATO to be beyond that now as well. To be beyond that now as well. Ms. Freeland, one can go further on. I'm fascinated, John, and I'd love to draw you out more, and if we have time, on your personal assessment of Ms. Freeland, because I've watched her for a very long time. I've never had the personal direct experience of her that you have had. But she's a very nasty piece of work indeed, and comes from a line of terribly nasty pieces of work. Her grandfather should have been prosecuted as a major Ukrainian war criminal. Her grandfather published the main, literally Nazi-supported official Nazi newspaper in occupied Ukraine through World War II. Her grandfather was documented as having visited Auschwitz and was fully open and supportive of the excellent work he saw going on there at the height of the Holocaust, of the Nazi extermination of the Jews. Now, Ms. Freeland has never been anti-Semitic personally to the slightest degree, but she is open, as we all know, about her ferocious anti-Russian hatred, which she inherited from her grandfather. And of course, she dresses it up in modern, liberal, woke, politically correct terms. She's a very nasty piece of work indeed. She was too much of an embarrassment even for anti-Russian right-wing Canadians in NATO. She grew to be, her background became too important. Her arrogance and unpopularity and incompetence eventually, after so many protected years at the top, became too much. And Mr. Carney was not expected to run rings around her to succeed her as he did, but he did. And this tells us something else, which you pointed out, John, and I agree with you. And that is Mr. Carney is a very capable political operator with an excellent politician's sense of tactical and strategic timing. And he's using that now to put the knife into President Trump. Now, as you rightly say, Pelle, these issues, I think from the American side, they play well to the president and his base, and a lot of his base is in the northern states. And when winds were blowing again for him, he might even have had a chance of turning Michigan and flipping Michigan and Minnesota, and using issues like this precisely to do so, because the agricultural and farming base and the industrial base in those areas, in many respects, would be highly sympathetic to his policies. But it's not going to happen this time for reasons John said, but it's not just Maine. Carney, on the one hand, is more widespread in his impact in America than we've discussed so far, but at the same time, he's not central. It isn't a question of a driving force through Susan's heart in Maine. It's a question of boosting the already massive tidal wave for Trump, against Trump, building up in the midterm elections across the United States. And remember also, midterm elections never have the turnout, or at least usually never have the turnout that presidential elections do. I suspect that will be the case here as well. But nevertheless, there will be enough of a strong, active reaction against Trump and his policies.
Marty, let's allow John the last few minutes. We've got 4 minutes left.
Yeah, by all means.
What's your thought to Martin, and what are your experiences of Christia? This is a topic that we're going to come back to. I mean, it's a very exciting dynamic, isn't it? You know, yeah.
I don't think she's worth ending a program on. I think that she is.
But you know her, John.
Viciously ambitious. She is in dealing with her when she can't abide any form of disagreement. Her arrogance leads her into hysterical fits. One of the odd things about the way Carney disposed of her was the relative control she kept in the Globe and Mail. The reporters of the Globe and Mail have been controlled by Freeland more than Carney, and they let her go with greater elegance and dignity than she deserved. Carney had no interest in diminishing her. He needed to hold the riding, make sure that a by-election wasn't called too soon. And frankly, he needs to hold the Nazi lobby. And you're
Yes,
right.
exactly.
Freeland's grandfather, Michael Chomiak, not only supported genocide, he profited from it. He took a printing press from murdered Jews who were killed in concentration camp. He took a car. He took antique furniture. He became a wealthy man. Then he fled westward with the Germans and became an agent for the U.S. Army intelligence. I mean, the record of Chrystia Freeland's family, I started to write up years back with great help from Canadian colleagues. But she's, for the time being, gone. The more Carney succeeds, the less that very ambitious woman will never be able to return to Canadian politics. And if Zelensky goes down, she goes down. She can sit in Oxford for the rest of her life, fuming. That's a very, let's put it this way, from a Freeland ambition point of view, a sinecure, a backwater. It's not what she wants. And this is the end of her if Carney succeeds now. Now, I accept my Canadian colleagues' skepticism to Prime Minister Blackrock. That's what they call him. And a suspicion from my friends towards Carney is merited. I'm not trying to make a case that he's a saint. I'm simply trying to explain, and both of us, all of us are agreeing, he's now handling Trump more cleverly than anyone else I can think of in the US empire. Can you think of anyone who's
John and
handling
Martin, we've got to wind up there. I'll just say, I mean, for once, is it the longest land board in the world, that between the United States and Canada? Two best friends in the world historically, you know, the Canadians never make a noise. And now we've got a genuine conflict there that's going to be very, very interesting to follow over the next few months. And so thank you for bringing that conflict out to our audience. And John, we'll come on again in 2 weeks. We'll probably talk about that or Russia.
Definitely.
Very, very interesting issues. Thank you, both of you, for an excellent show. Thank you.